All right. So we have Alex Pang with us today, chiming in from the Bay Area. And Alex Sujong Kim Pang, hopefully I pronounced this right, studies people, technology, and the worlds they make. And he writes a lot of books. One of them is Shorter, Work Smarter, Better, and Less. Here's How. The other one is Rest. And Alex has a book on digital well-being as well, which he will share some of his insights with us in this presentation. And he has a consulting company called Strategy and Rest, where he works with governments and companies around the world, trialing the 4-day work week. So Alex has been gracious enough with his time to come in and talk to us about digital well-being, with the topic of digital well-being is a public health issue, not a personal one. So with that, here's Alex.
Great. Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk today. So I am sort of author most recently of a book about the global movement to shorten the work week, which has and the fact is it's a fairly global movement as sort of the variety of translations, Icelandic, Korean, Portuguese, and there are several others that are in the works, I think, illustrates. And this is something that I've been it's something I've been sort of talking about with audiences, but also sort of working with companies to figure out how to how to design trial periods, how to prototype shorter work weeks, and how to and how to make all of that sort of a success. Like I said, this is not only is it a global movement, it's also one that encompasses a variety of industries, ranging from software startups like Woo Brothers, which is a kind of DoorDash or Deliveroo equivalent in Korea, to little factories that make sort of kitchenware in the Midlands of England. The companies that do this are quite varied, but all of them decide to try a 4-day work week as a way of trying to solve some very big problem, right? They're doing it not because they want to reinvent capitalism or kind of rethink the relationship between time and productivity, but because they have serious problems with, for example, recruitment and retention, or with work-life balance, with they want to help parents manage the challenge of of having interesting careers while also being responsible adults. They also often want to promote creativity and learning among the founders and employees. And then finally, also just avoiding founder burnout is a big motivation as well. There were statistics in the US that indicate that company founders are several times more likely to suffer from stress, depression, burnout, other kinds of issues as their employees. And especially in small companies, this can really represent an existential threat to the success of an enterprise. So they do a variety of things in order to make a 4-day week work, and a number of them connect, I think, with digital well-being in ways that are rather illuminating, right? In order to figure out how to do 5 days worth of work in 4, they're all more thoughtful about how they use technologies, particularly social media or communications technologies, which means that they do things like build out rules for email or Slack during the day, doing things, often relatively simple things like having particular times of day when you have email checks, when you're on the, on whatever other services you're on, but also having periods where it's okay to switch those off and to focus on your key work. And so these periods of focused work are something that get built in as a formal part of company schedules, balanced though usually with periods for social time. So, for example, in lots of these places, people start eating lunch as a group, which is a small thing, but actually quite a powerful one. And then also imposing or implementing rules or social norms around stuff like the right to disconnect after work, right? It doesn't do you a whole lot of good to have a 4-day week if if you and your people are just bouncing messages back and forth sort of in the evenings and now on a 3-day weekend rather than a 2-day weekend. That clearly defeats both the sort of intent and the purpose of the of an exercise like this. But I think that, one of the important things that these kinds of that these companies and the work that they do in order to implement a shorter work week teaches us, it actually has some important lessons about how we should think about well-being generally, and I think digital well-being in particular, which is that we often think of of efforts at self-care as very much focused on the self. They are things that individuals do alone. Likewise, I think we tend, it's easy to think about digital well-being or issues of attention and focus, distraction avoidance, as just things that happen between your screen and your eyes and your brain. And the good part of that, I think, is that it is a reminder that we all have choices that we can make or practices that we can change around our relationships with our devices, with the way in which we think about the place of technologies in our lives, ways in which we can emphasize the fact that we often treat these things as less as objects out in the world and more as extensions of ourselves. And this can have a good dimension as well as a problematic one. But I think but one of the things that these companies have taught me is that it is also important to recognize that digital well-being is also a collective endeavor. I'd mentioned that they have social norms around email or Slack. And I think one of the things that this reminds us is that social norms around social media are collective, work better when they are collective rules rather than individual or competitive rules. So, and indeed, more generally, these efforts at well-being within these companies are collective endeavors rather than personal ones. All too often it's the case that the challenge of figuring out how to make work better for ourselves comes potentially or runs the risk of coming at the expense of other people's schedules, routines, the needs of the organization, what have you, in ways that end up damaging our ability to put them into practice in as fully as we would like. Making these collective endeavors, on the other hand, means that my success does not come at my colleague's expense, but rather we all succeed at them together. Right. It's also the case that we learn that the sorts of routines that things like ring fencing meetings and having times of day for deep focused work and times for more collaborative or kinds of social work. These sorts of routines improve boundaries and practices in ways that enhance both the performance of groups, but also the well-being of individuals. And then, I think all of this together, all of these good work practices enable the kind of disconnection that is an important part of digital well-being, though I think, it can't be the only part. So rather than think about digital well-being mainly as something that happens between ourselves and our devices, I think it's worth recognizing that actually collective action is a really powerful form of self-care. And given how many of our sort of everyday practices around technologies are formed or reinforced in the workplace, recognizing that there are ways in which we can more successfully achieve the aims of promoting digital well-being by thinking of these as collective enterprises, by thinking of these as matters of sort of developing workable social norms as opposed to personal things, that all that doing that provides a really powerful way of, you know, making digital well-being accessible to sort of to more people, but also improving the odds that any one of us will will succeed at it. So that's my argument. So, and with that, I will close and say thank you very much. So, and I will stop share.
We just had one more person join us. It appears that we had an issue with the password link, hence a few participants. Sorry about that. So, Alex, that's a very powerful and counterintuitive argument that we're in this together, and it's partly how we all perceive it. So where do we want to go from here? What are you seeing in the workplace from both leaders, willing or not willing to take on the responsibility, and pushing it back on individuals?
Well, okay, so I think that this is, I mean, my response, I guess, has two parts. I mean, one is that doing this successfully requires having leaders also doing it as well, right? A lot of these norms sort of come from the top. And if you really want them to be sort of to take hold, you need the example of people in charge. Very often the people who were most adamant about sort of about policing older norms, participating in the creation of new ones. This is not easy for most of them, but it is something that is that is essential. The second thing is that I think that that the good part of this is that, at least in the companies that have moved to 4-day weeks, this is not a story of pushing back onto individuals responsibility for figuring out how to make this work without the attendant power to change the way in which workflows happen, in which communication happens, meetings are organized, etc. The movement to shorten work weeks starts at the top, but really is implemented from the bottom up in a way that so far empowers workers rather than diminishes their control over their work and the workplace. One important part of that is that people figure out together how to implement these practices actually kind of on the ground and in their daily routines. So I think that the successful leaders are the ones who, in a sense, don't lead by telling people how to do it, but lead by creating the conditions that allow them to figure out how to make this work for themselves in their particular workplaces and in their days.
So from your point of view, you're looking at digital well-being as what happens during work hours.
I would, I think in this particular context, yes, but I think that the defense of it is that an awful lot of our norms around number one, our social norms around technology get worked out in the workplace when we're adults. Second, no significant part of the pressure that we have to do things that are, fundamentally not particularly healthy for us in the long run with technologies come from, also come from the workplace. And so if you can solve those problems there, then you go a long way to being able to sort of improve them in the rest of your lives.
So in your eyes, does the future belong to a world of no email?
Good question. I mean, in the sense that, okay, if you think of email as like an evolution of the corporate memorandum, which is something that has its origins, I think, in the 1910s or 1920s, this is a kind of which itself is sort of a version of, of the letter. This is a medium that manages to reinvent itself with a high sort of regularly. I think that email won't disappear completely, but I do think that there certainly are elements of email practice that we need to back away from. In the novelty of being able to send and receive these things nearly instantaneously, the fact that you could communicate with people very rapidly, in sort of in other parts of the world, has tended to shift from the technical capacity to do that to the moral imperative that that we must communicate with each other at this kind of pace. And I think that is something that having lived with email for 30 years now, maybe we can be a little less impressed by. I think that email is also interesting because, in contrast to newer systems that have consciously set out to be designed to maximize engagement, responsiveness, to use various kinds of nudges to try and get people to stay on the system, right? You see this with Slack, with the likes and the smiley faces and sort of the preference toward sort of high velocity notifications. Email just basically kind of sits there. And despite that, a lot of us feel like, it is got to be one of the first things we look at in the morning and when we wake up, and one of the last things we look at night, and to engage with constantly throughout the day, as opposed to more episodically. So now I don't think it's going to go away, but I do think that it's possible right now to change social norms around how we read and how we respond to email, to how we use it. And, there are also on the edges design things that we're starting to see in services like Superhuman or other attempts to reinvent email so that it is not this kind of overwhelming tsunami of kind of manufactured urgency and content irrelevance, but actually has a utility. It is both useful and not something that takes over our lives.
I want to open it up to other questions from the audience, but I have one that I want to pursue in the email conversation. How do you, when you work with companies, how do you begin to change leaders' habits and expectations? Because that's one thing I hear a lot from, especially people in the Unhustle You community, and the people that I work with who come to me and say, how do you create boundaries when the expectation is there to respond to emails within an hour or 30 minutes or whatever it is, and respond on weekends? And if you're not responding, then you're not considered engaged employee.
I think starting with policies for for disconnecting after hours is a good place to start, for a couple of reasons. And number one is that when you're out of the office, there are other things that you can non-business things that you can more easily occupy yourself with. You're more likely to get more kind of social reinforcement sort of at home around not checking, email at the dinner table or while you're spending time with the kids. That's going to be, I think, probably self-evidently seen as a good thing. And I think we also systematically overestimate how urgent our clients or others treat messages that they send us. Right. There is this wonderful, Leslie Perlow's book, Sleeping with Your Cell Phone, has that wonderful story about Boston, a consulting company in Boston that implemented a no email on Wednesday evenings policy. So just one evening a week. The senior partners thought that, this was going to be, the death of capitalism, and the earth was going to crash into the sun, and all the clients were going to go, to McKinsey. And they went ahead and did it. And 6 months later, in the course of doing kind of check-ins with clients, asked about this, and none of the clients had even noticed. And so that fact, that to me is a lovely example of how this habit might be one that we can push back against a little more successfully than we think. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I actually used to sleep with my phone, so I know what it did to my brain, it scrambled my brain. And I realized that when you scramble your brain, it's really hard to focus and do any kind of creative work or deep work, because then you're constantly addicted to pushing that lever and getting the email notification. These days, I've completely changed how I work, and I have various apps and I have no notifications, and I have apps installed that I can't even get into my email, it locks you out, which is actually not helpful either sometimes when you have like a Zoom call and you need to check if somebody sent you a message, right? So, but I don't have to respond to people. And I feel like there is a very fine line from leaders as to the importance of email responding versus the deep focused work. Right. And I think until we figure our priorities from that perspective, we're just on fire, and we're just go, and we're stuck in our inboxes.
Yeah, I think that I don't meet or talk to a lot of leaders who say, what they have right now is too much time for strategic thinking, right? I'm spending too much time on deep work, and really what I need to do more of is the little stuff on my to-do list. I need to be more in reactive mode. Nobody says that. And so, I think that part of the power of of implementing the evening email policy is that it's a way to begin to teach you that the earth doesn't spin off its axis if we don't hit refresh every 15 minutes, and it begins, and it sets a precedent that allows us to begin to think more seriously about how else we can change our behavior. It's having starting with something that has a higher likelihood that's relatively simple and has a higher likelihood of success, and teaches a couple useful lessons about the false urgency of email and the value of boundaries and context for helping us build better behavior. That's a good first lesson that we can then begin to bring back into the workplace and can begin to apply with our colleagues. The final thing I would say with leaders is, you're actually in charge, right? And there tends to be an assumption that that particularly like younger workers will never go with this. They're always on their phones, etc. And that there is a sort of fixity to other people's practices that that cannot be overcome, and it's almost impolite to ask. And I think that this is that the leaders who do bring this up and do try to do promote these different social norms don't meet with age-based resistance or generational resistance, but I think but tend to find that sort of everybody does eventually get behind it. So
That's interesting. I was just going to ask you about that. So speaking of the younger generation, the digital natives who are basically born with their phones
mhm.
on Instagram or Facebook, and their digital lives really sometimes come before their real lives. I mean, they're constantly on a phone, even though some of them are realizing that that's not right, and there's a big pushback. And I've met just as many young people who are not on their phones. There's like the Gen Z and the millennials constituting, was it 144 million people in the US, like making up a large proportion of the workforce. Do you think if they're constantly connected on their phones, and we know what that does to your brain, and we know
Mhm.
about the dopamine behavior, how realistic is it then to ask or expect and see different behavior during work hours?
Right. So my response is I've got two kids who are 22 and 19, and one just graduated from college, one is still in. And, these are kids who got their first iPhones when they were like, 10 and 8. And both of them are fairly serious student athletes. And I once asked my daughter's basketball coach, who was a former NBA player and has had a successful second career, sort of coaching high school teams. So, how do you talk kids out of sort of being on their phones, right? How do you deal with that distraction? And he looked at me like sort of I was the stupidest person in the universe. And the answer was that in that context, kids have no trouble whatsoever getting off their phones. They know they're not supposed to. They know if they try, you're going to break your phone if you try and hold it and play basketball at the same time. The whole thing was just and sort of it. And for a generation that supposedly, never puts their phones down, they had no trouble in that context putting their phone down. And so I think that that if it is more useful to start from the assumption that their behavior is no more hardwired by by Steve Jobs and Joni Ive and BJ Fogg than our behavior, and that while there are these and that in in the right context, with the right sort of encouragement and or rewards, that it's just as possible for for young people to change their practices as it is for sort of anybody else. So
Interesting. So basically, from everything I've been researching about getting into a state of flow, if you can get into that state and then you get all these cocktails of neurochemicals flowing to your brain, you'll be just as feeling rewarded and happy as if you're doing it from the phone. But in reality of the situation, we get disrupted every 11 minutes, and then takes you 25 minutes to get back into that deep focused work.
mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering, how much have we scrambled our brains, and how realistic is it to do that focused work?
It is. I tend to the side of optimism and to say that the human capacity for concentration and desire for flow seems to be pretty enduring. Number one. I think that the work that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and his school have done sort of on this suggests that the capacity for flow and the desire for it are pretty universal, and that they are not confined to, Tuscan peasants, but rather are is something that you can see whether you're talking about software developers in Silicon Valley, or reindeer herders, or people working in delicatessens. The second is one of the nice things about neuroplasticity is never having to say you're sorry. That yes, we have been entrained to some degree by semi-distracting workplaces, but that stuff is changeable, and I would, and I think that it's good to foreground that rather than, it's more valuable to foreground that than to sort of lament the impact that it has had on us so far. So
Thank you for that. I just have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the group and everybody
cool.
else. And that is, can you speak on good for humans technology?
Good for humans technology. That really should be pretty much all of them. I mean, okay, so the thing is that we often think of technologies as things that kind of exist outside of humans, and that sort of and that dehumanize us sort of as a result of sort of our using them. The problem with that, though, is that humans have an amazing capacity to use technologies in ways that augment and extend our physical abilities, our sort of mental capacity, and that this is something that we're actually really, really good at, and that we can get an awful lot of pleasure from. If you go back and read Flow, an awful lot of the things that people describe as sort of experiences that get them into flow are ones that involve good technologies. Or if you read, early accounts of the bicycle, like in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people were absolutely rapturous about how the bicycle gave you this new intimacy of feeling with the road, and that the bicycle itself felt like an extension of your own body, and that you were no longer a person in a machine, but you were some magical combination that transcended both of them. And these are like bicycles from 1905 with these are things that weighed like 60 pounds and had one gear that kind of that worked sometimes. So even with what we would regard as relatively clunky technology, humans exhibit this great capacity to very quickly come to incorporate technologies into our sense of ourselves, such that they become less like tools that we use and more like extensions of ourselves. Good technologies, I would argue, are ones that that are designed with that in mind, and that increase both our capacities, whether that's speed, ability to remember stuff, what have you, and that allow us to maintain control over those technologies, rather than using that connection as a way of as a kind of back door for installing a company's interests in our attention or our activity. So, I think that one of the things that companies here in the Valley have been really good at is essentially hijacking attention and hijacking flow, and turning it into a commodity that you can resell to advertisers. And the problem there is that we want to respond to those technologies in much the same way that these social media, in the same way that we respond to people, or to or to technologies that we can control. The problem is that we don't really have the same level of control over them, and I think that is what is at root and that's what is fundamental to this process of the feeling that they take control of us. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Let's appreciate that. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience. I know Michelle put a comment in here about a virtual co-working platform to get into flow quickly that's helped her achieve her goals in a short amount of time. And it's flow.club. I don't know if Michelle wants to comment or...
I would love to hear more about this. This is the first time I've ever heard of it. Tell us more, please.
Sorry, I was multitasking.
No, that's perfect. Yeah,
that is such an irony.
I'm not a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few co-working platforms now that's talking about flow with its concept. So it's literally 60 minutes and like 5 minutes going around the group, just telling people what you're hoping to achieve. And then the 50 minutes of deep work, like everyone leaves their camera on and the host plays music. And then 5 minutes afterwards to regroup. And I've gotten things done. Like I basically did, I think I have a LinkedIn post on this. I did like 50 hours of work in 3 weeks, but I got everything I needed to get done for my business. So I was able to find work-life balance.
Okay, so this is not a particular piece of software. This is like a piece of social engineering. This is literally a group of people talking about what they're going to do and then doing it for 15 minutes and then talking about and then reporting back for 5. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
it's like all strangers. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's something
Totally fascinating.
Yeah, so that's something, Alex, we want to experiment in the Unhustle You community and just say, okay, Mondays from 10 to 11, we work together. It's something I experienced in another community in Nest Labs, and it was a writing group, and we got together, and it was actually an evening thing. We got together, and it was very similar to what Michelle was explaining. It was like 90 minutes with a break in between. I personally found it... we need to experiment. I personally found it a little hard because I think people get into their flow state at different levels, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, now it's a break time. And I was like, but no, I was just in the middle of flow and this is now interrupting me. So on one side, I found it very motivating and inspiring to say, okay, I'm going to shut everything down and work. But on the other side, I found that if I was in a creative state, it kicked me out of it, not when I wanted.
How long did you experiment with that?
Just once.
Okay. Because I mean, I think that the sort of the couple thoughts, number one, that this is that Michelle, what you're describing is a kind of social version. It's another version of how something I've seen, which is that, attention and focus very much are social resources, right? My ability, if you're in a workplace, my ability to concentrate depends on my colleagues' ability to respect my, my need to get stuff done. The interesting other thing here is that there are benefits that come from doing what seem like this apparently, deeply solitary thing, namely whatever you're undertaking in this 50 minutes, in the company of other people who are likewise engaged in their own versions of this activity. This is why going to the library during finals was was an energizing and productive experience for plenty of us. Even if we weren't all studying the same stuff together, the fact that everyone, is preparing for exams, definitely has benefits. So Flow Club. Are there others like this or other kinds of things that you've encountered that you've used that have generated these kinds of benefits for you?
Oh, was that to me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. No, this is the one that I've been using. I was introduced, and I would add on that some people do use one session to kickstart their full day because sometimes they're more in the creative profession. They just need to start with the social aspect, as you were mentioning, and the other aspect is, I think a lot of us in Flow Club are a bit competitive, so we try to just try to get things done in 50 minutes. So we don't try to cram 5 things. Maybe just get one thing done well.
Awesome.
So it's the focus and really gets you in right away.
Right.
Awesome. So we actually have the platform to make this possible, so we can experiment in the Unhustle You platform and designate some Flow Club hours. I'll be willing to experiment again. And see how that works. And thank you so much, Michelle. That's awesome. We had a question from Iris.
Please, yes.
Hi, yeah. I have a question, that's for sure. But I also want to jump in on the conversation that there's, I think it's also in the US, that there's something called The Cave. And it's a super big organization that organizes these focus hours. And they have big schedule available to jump in. Also, I think you pay quite some money to enable your own focus sessions. But and apart from that, I heard from some companies that they also facilitate this, or that groups of colleagues, they organize this with them together to get to this focus state.
Is this cave day?
The cave, I think. Deep
Okay.
work, they also work with the concept deep work.
Sure.
Deep work in the cave, I think, is their slogan.
Interesting. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for that, Iris. And what was your question?
Yeah, I have two, so maybe you can choose the one you like. One was, I really like the 4-day work week concept that you're really promoting for. And I was just in the beginning of COVID and everybody started working at home, I came across an article that I never really heard anyone about after. It was that the 8-hour workday should be changed to the 6-hour workday if you're working from home, because you can only focus so much time, or really, I say that, work so many hours in a row. And normally you would talk to your colleagues, stand at a coffee machine, walk to your meetings, have this time to commute. Maybe we have differences also in Europe and the US with here the 8-hour workday is like the most common thing. Maybe that's more hours in the US. I'm not sure about that. But after that, now we work from home for 1.5 years already. But it seems like people started working 9 hours a day here. And there's actually an increase of productivity. So yeah, I was curious about that. And then the other question, when you spoke about like a world without email, I'm fantasizing about a world without email on smartphones. I think that's reasonable, and that's like we can get there. But I was wondering if you know of any examples of organizations that have these rules for email and for Slack, if they also have rules on like what devices to install email applications on or not.
Interesting question. Okay, to take them in reverse, I do not know. I don't, but I also haven't probed that deeply. I haven't asked that specific question. So it might be that that they're encouraging people to not have, your work email client or account on, on your personal phone. And it would certainly be a sensible thing to do as a way of, of better kind of managing one's attention and preventing interruptions and distractions. I also, I hear a lot about people doing stuff like sort of constructing white lists so that, things that, so that, people who have the right to interrupt you have the ability to do so. And so you get messages from those people or notifications about them, but everybody else gets something else that's much less obtrusive. So, I mean, you kind of think about, I sort of think about it this way. On my phone, I have something that I call the zombie apocalypse list, which is during the zombie apocalypse, who do I need to be able to call? Now, this assumes, of course, that phones work. And those people have one ringtone, and it's family members and a couple other close friends. And then everybody else in the world has a much more discreet sort of ringtone. And the idea here is that when I hear the opening bars of Derek and the Dominoes Layla, which is sort of what I've got for family, I am always going to hear that no matter what. And and it is very rare that I will not stop what I'm doing if, my wife or one of my kids are calling. On the other hand, very few other people have, have the right to interrupt me in that same way. And I want to be able to make the choice about whether I want to stop what I'm doing and take this call. And having a few bars of one of Yo-Yo Ma's recordings of Bach solo concerto for cello is a great way to do that. But I think so. I mean, I think that the idea of having having better device-specific rules does make plenty of sense. And as we accumulate more of these devices, it makes more and more sense to do that. As for working time during the pandemic and shift to 4-day weeks, I think the two things I'll say is that it's absolutely the case that most studies indicate that people are working longer hours during the pandemic. People, particularly women, are also spending more time doing childcare because essentially they're on Zoom meetings while simultaneously trying to homeschool, and also keep the network going because everybody's on everything simultaneously. It's also the case that there are plenty of companies who I've been in touch with who moved to a 4-day week during the pandemic because they found that, first off, moving to all remote work meant that they had to get really serious about using, collaboration tools better and remote work kinds of tools, which improved individual productivity or helped with group collaboration sufficiently so that it was possible to give some time back to people exactly at a time when, since no one's in the office, you're a little more flexible about how you think about your workday, and people really needed more time for other stuff in their lives. And I think one of the good things, or one of the few good things that has come out of the pandemic, is we have seen that it is possible to change how we work much more dramatically and more quickly than we ever thought possible. And we ought to build on that, right? That's a good capability. And that I think for many companies, sort of the ability to move to a 4-day week is something that they now possess. It's just a question of whether they want to put it into practice and whether they see the benefits of it as, a supplement or something that from which they can build better policies around, flexible and remote work, whether it's a way of encouraging people back into the office, but not in the same way that they not for as many days of the week as they had previously, and as a way of offering a structural solution to some of the problems around work-life balance, family, work management, and interference that we have tried for years without enduring success to solve. So there we are.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate it. I want to be mindful of your time.
Yeah.
I really, really appreciate all your feedback. I appreciate Iris and Michelle jumping in with us today. And let's keep the conversation going. I'm excited to connect with more people and kind of lead these efforts on digital well-being and shorter work week and designing life first, work second, and all these topics that we're interested in. So if you want to learn more about Alex's work, you can visit him at strategy.rest. Anything else you want to add, Alex?
That's where I write new stuff about or the global movement to shorten working hours, about technology and distraction, about the importance of rest. And you can jump from there to other stuff or appearances or podcasts, etc. So that's where to go. Awesome. And also, Instagram or Twitter. I'm Ask Pang on all of those. Instagram is mainly pictures of my dogs, so which is not at all a bad thing. They're very photogenic dogs.
I like your dogs.
So,
Thank you so much, Alex. It's been awesome to have you with us. And if you want to learn more about Unhustle, check out unhustle.com. Thank you so much, guys.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.